from the Premier League, not from their members, by the way. And here we are at a big crisis, and suddenly they're at the centre of it. Now, Simon, first of all, let me just look at it from their point of view. In an industry which has seen literally endless elastic growth in the payment of players at every level. No one's saying the boys in League One and League Two are millionaires or anything, but all wages have gone up exponentially, extraordinary amounts, particularly at the top of the game in the past 10 years. The PFA will presumably they're concerned about any pay cut, pay deferral, temporary pay cut, whatever it is going to be.
Yep.
Is that it will become the benchmark for the future? Because what are we actually talking? What are we actually talking about first here? We're talking about the players taking a pay cut temporarily, and then they go back to the original contract.
Yeah, I wrote an article about 3 or 4 weeks ago about talking about a pay cut, because when it all blew up and the crisis began to really become a crisis in people's minds, football clubs came straight out and said front and centre, we're in real trouble. So the idea was not to morph and mutate into how football clubs can fund the NHS or communities. It was, okay, the one industry that needs to get itself together and fund itself because it's got an embarrassment of riches is the football industry. So I came up with an idea of restructuring and cutting player salaries for 90 days and then using that money distributed into a central fund that, say, the Premier League manage with trustees that then distribute it down to the lesser clubs so they can meet their obligations. Now, if that revenue comes back because somehow or another the league manages to restart with attendances inside stadiums and so on and so forth, then that money can be drip-fed back in proportionate percentage terms back to the players that effectively had their wages cut.
Right.
So it's not a very challenging thing. It's not a very difficult thing. And when I listen to some of the stuff over the weekend that's coming out from the media and from the PFA, I made the sort of trite comment about it's taken 9 days to build a hospital in London for 4,000 people, and it seems to take 3 weeks for the PFA and the players to get together to decide whether they're going to take a pay cut. It's not difficult, Danny. They either want to take a pay cut or they don't, and then it becomes a discussion about how deep that pay cut is, and then it becomes a discussion about the mechanism for distributing it. And sitting there ruminating, the Germans have done it, and here's an idea behind the Germans. Maybe it's because they got the 50+1 rule inside their clubs, where the fans have the control over what the clubs do.
Exactly.
That might be the thinking. That's why it's so much smoother in there. But the Italians have done it, the Germans have done it, and the Spanish have done it. It's defending the indefensible when people like Gary Neville and Gary Lineker come out and turn around and say it's only been 2 or 3 weeks and players want to do the right thing. Well, in my experience of players, there are lots of players that want to do the right thing, and they tend to be the senior pros. They tend to be the older, wiser pros. But within the confines of the game, that doesn't seem to manifest itself across the spectrum. And
so
also,
what is happening now, Simon, then? Is the PFA, with genuine concerns, being a roadblock to what you seem to think is the right thing to do, at least for the football industry?
I'm not sure they are, Danny.
Or is it the players just don't want to take the cut?
It's really simple, Danny. If you're Jordan Henderson at Liverpool, just to pick an example, right? And I'm just not particularly picking on Jordan Henderson, but he's just a name that's come to mind. If you're the club captain, you go to the players in your dressing room and say, we're taking a 25% pay cut from Liverpool players. Fine, that's done. Liverpool done. That then sets a blueprint for everyone else to follow. Now, that might not be what people want to do. I'd much prefer an en masse solution, which is that everyone understands where they are and this is what they do. Now, the idea that players, and I'm not just looking at players are not public enemy number one, and certain segments of the media making that way is wrong. But the idea that players hide behind their agents and the PFA when there's trouble. And 90% of the time, 99% of footballers don't want anything to do with the PFA because they think they're a waste of time. Now, all of a sudden, the PFA are being put up to find their solutions. And, of course, the PFA have done what a union does. Whether you like Gordon Taylor or whether you don't like Gordon Taylor, and I've had many challenges with Gordon over the year, but one thing you cannot argue with the fact is that Gordon Taylor is an effective and efficient negotiator. His time may have been and gone. The PFA may be an organisation that might be outmoded, being investigated by the charities commissions for their own funding and their own distribution of money. But the one thing that fella's been able to do is run a union for the benefit of his members and ultimately himself at times. So you put a tough negotiator in, he's going to negotiate in a tough fashion. But the players are effectively the intellectual architects behind what they want their union to do. Simple. I've not heard one player, I've heard them ruminate, we want to help. I've not heard one player turn around and say, we'll take a pay cut, tell us how deep.
Okay, Simon, you mentioned Spain there, and I know that's where you have your experience. You were still there when this was going on. All we heard about was Lionel Messi taking a pay cut. What's happened in Spain? Have all professional players in La Liga taken a cut?
There has been a blueprint set by specifically Barcelona and ultimately Real Madrid around their players, and the other clubs have fallen in line with it. And that is because when you set the idea that Liverpool and Tottenham, two of the most profitable clubs in the last year, took a stance. They took a stance to be able to go down the furlough route, a very unpopular stance that makes them look bad. But there's a bigger picture there. So the idea that the Germans, the Italians and the Spanish clubs have fallen in line with the strategy. The players don't particularly want to have pay cuts, but they understand the ramifications and the reasons behind it. And ultimately, if the revenue drops back in, these players, it shouldn't be a cut for a cut's sake. And the idea, and I don't understand this, Danny, and it's always been something that really troubled me about this mentality that players seem to have, which is that chairman and owners are all there to rip them off. So the sentiment has been, we want to know, the PFA have put out a very clever statement, Danny. It's a very clever statement designed to dismantle some of the positioning that clubs are doing, which is basically put the players in the spotlight by saying, hang on a second, if we take a pay cut, the tax office is going to be worse off. Hold on a second. The tax office gets £190 billion a year. It can do without the 200 million from the footballers for a couple of months. That's 0.1% of the Exchequer's revenue on tax comes from footballers for that 90 days. But the idea somehow that the footballers are saying, we want to know where this money's going, where it's going to go to a central fund, I suspect, which is going to be distributed to those that need it within the confined. It's not going to go to bolster the reserves of football clubs. It's not going to go to make billionaire owners more money. And this idea that the salaries that players are being paid are good, they trust their owners when they're paying their salaries, but when an owner comes to them and says, hang on a second, I need you to take a disc, no, I don't trust you then. There's something fundamentally wrong. I trust my agent, I trust the PFA, but I don't trust the guy that pays my salary. I've never understood how that works. Now, I know, Dan, dollars for donuts, there are owners out there that will use this to get rid of liabilities they don't want to. And every single football club should have to produce 90-day rolling cash flows to show to people what they've lost and to be able to substantiate it. And then that hole can be plugged by the cuts and by the reductions in player salaries. And if they can't substantiate it, because they'll soon get double lively of producing their figures and be able to substantiate them if they've got a pot of cash that's going to help them, 90-day rolling cash flow, show me how you've lost that money, we'll plug it with this, and if you get it back, then you have to repay it. Not difficult. It's not difficult.
And so what we have here would be, effectively, because you're saying, and I understand this and I agree with you, it's not the Football Association, it's not football's job to fund the NHS. That is the job of central government. But these pay cuts would be to finance through a central and independently overseen fund. They make sure that other clubs didn't go out of business further down the pyramid, and even in the Premier League. So you could argue, if you're the PFA, that this scheme would be to the benefit of the majority of their members, and they would be actually the more wealthy members of their fraternity, to use that word, would be helping out the others.
Absolutely. I mean, so that is what we listen to this much overused expression, the football family. Well, you know what? The football family is like, it's not like the Partridge family, it's like the Addams family. It doesn't, it's a ghastly looking family at times. It doesn't look after one another at all and tries to take advantages of one another. And the idea, we saw it last week with the football clubs writing to UEFA about making sure that Man City's ban sticks. In this time of need, in this time of crisis, we got time to write a letter to UEFA making sure
that
these guys...
That was unnecessary. That was totally unnecessary. Nobody wants... Yeah.
But that is the football family and its finest. But in this instance, the Premier League players have had a very good run and a very good opportunity to make a lot of money, and no one's suggesting that this is an easy decision. But you know what, Danny? If you want to make a decision, you can make a decision. It doesn't take 3, 4... They'll turn around and say now, well, hang on a second, Jordan, it doesn't make any difference because the March payroll's gone. We haven't got to do anything until April anyway. Okay, well, that's great. Prevaricate and pontificate. Football and sport is at a crossroads, and it's got an opportunity now to really light up the nation with its own thinking. If it wants to donate lots of money to causes, that's fantastic. But the first cause that it needs to look after to some extent is not to implode, because people value their sporting institutions. People believe that ultimately their sporting institution means something, and people are not going to want to see it, health being the first thing, but not want to go and see things in their lives disappear if the football world can't survive itself. And I'm not suggesting that's the most important thing, Danny, but this whole started, it's been hijacked, Danny. It's been turned into something else because Matt Hancock made an observation which has now been hijacked, and it's deflecting the players away from what their real obligation is. You're either going to take a pay cut or you're not.
Okay, listen, I forgot to give out the phone number. If you've got anything to say about anything myself and Simon have said, and of course these matters are all slippery, you may have a view of your own. 08717 223344. That number again is 08717 223344. Trying to get some calls on during the next half hour. Simon, we've got a lot to talk about here, but before the break, let me ask you another question. Where are the broadcasts in all this? And I ask this because so far we've had the most incredibly symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
I believe that the big television companies, their film channels are all very well, their news production's fine, all the rest of it, but the thing that's causes them to have subscribers is football. So they're reliant on football, but football is reliant on them because of the amount of money they pump in. Are the broadcasters, we saw, all right, I'll do it another way. Canal Plus have the French broadcaster who own the football rights have told Liga they are not paying them for the time that they're not paying.
And so have BN. They've done the same.
Exactly.
And that's been.
Is there any danger that Sky and BT will say the same thing to the Premier League?
Of course there is. What I would caveat that with is that BN were the major one, and they are actually coming to the end of their contract with La Ligue. So this is their last season. So there might be a little bit of positioning going on there. But where the real threat is, Dan, is that the Sky and the BTs of the world, the domestic broadcasters, which make up about 60% of the overall money, they're going to be probably more difficult, or find it more difficult to want to kill the golden goose because of the long-term relationship, the revenue generations, and their reasons for having a business model based around sport. But the overseas broadcasters that have £200 million relationships, £100 million relationship, they're getting their contracts breached by a lack of content. They're not going to have the same problem. So if the broadcasters via the total amount is about 8.7 billion, of which 5.2 is from the domestics, 3 to 3.5 is from the overseas. The overseas revenue is the threat because we do not have the same relationship with the overseas broadcasters that we do with Sky. So it is very, very real that there is a challenge here for the Premier League clubs. And if that challenge manifests itself this season and Sky double down, then you're in a situation where the TV companies are going to take back £38 million from each Premier League football club, which will wipe out all the profitability of each Premier League club. It will wipe out £762 million from the league. Then on top of that, each Premier League club is probably going to lose between another 5 and 10 million in gate receipts. You're talking about real challenges that have to be factored in, and that might not happen, Danny, but that might happen. So people have got to plan for it rather than say, oh, I got here and it's a disaster. What am I going to do now? You've got a plan.
Okay, we'll talk about how all of this is playing out in the media very soon. So by the media, I mean not just me and you, but also the way the public are receiving all of this, because, of course, it is becoming a bit of a publicity mess now. We'll talk about next here who has the moral obligation to do what. We've heard what Simon thinks should be done to help the game, and my views that the furloughs on the surface are really, really not what that was designed for, but they may be part of something bigger. How's this all playing out, and who has got the right to talk about it? We'll talk about that next here on The Final Word. Simon Jordan's here, I'm Danny Kelly, and you're our listening minutes, and we'd love you for that. Simple as that.